Welcome, everyone. I'm Molly Brunson, Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and History of Art at Yale University. Welcome to the Humanity Dialogues. Today, I'm welcoming you as Faculty Director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. The Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program has sponsored this event today. The Humanity Dialogues has been organized as a response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is a conversation to reflect on contingency as existence and the critical intertwining of art and politics within societies at war. This will be the first in a series that will continue in the days and weeks ahead. And I'd ask that you please follow the link in the chat, which will appear shortly, to subscribe to our mailing list so that you're notified of future events. Our topic for today is Tyranny, Artists and Agency, Ukraine Now. We are very lucky to have two prominent cultural and intellectual leaders to launch this first conversation. Vasyl Cherepanyn is the director of the Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv, Ukraine, an interdisciplinary platform for collaboration between artists, activists, and academics, and between art, knowledge, and politics. Vasyl will be joined in conversation by Timothy Snyder, the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Our conversation will be moderated by my co-organizer of the Humanity Dialogues, Marta Kuzma. Marta is a professor of art and the former dean of the Yale School of Art. She spent the 1990s in Kyiv founding and directing the Soros Center for Contemporary Art. Please join me in welcoming our guests today. Marta, you are muted.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you for being so accommodating and working so quickly on helping to organize what I felt was a very important series of talks to bring together discussions about what is going on in Ukraine from those who are within Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, and with those very knowledgeable about the country and the region and the geopolitical situation there. We begin today, and I am very grateful that we are joined with Vasyl Cherepanyn. Serdecznie wdzięczna za waszą uczest, Wasylu. Dobry wieczór. And together with
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And also Professor Timothy Snyder, who has been very busy engaged in the discussions of what's going on right now in Ukraine. And so we have a lot to discuss in this hour, and I am going to ask just directly, Professor Snyder, we know very much from the history and what you have written and what I understand that Ukraine has always been under a large imperialist paw of Russia, culturally and politically. And so the question is, why now? Why the invasion now? I think there was something like 18% of Ukrainians actually believed that there would be a military invasion and that this was a political play going on between Russia and United States as to NATO. So if you could speak to that.
Thank you. I mean, I want to start this conversation by by acknowledging how much I have learned from my Ukrainian friends and colleagues. And in particular, I want to also welcome Vasyl Cherepanyn. Thanks to Vasyl, I've been able to give a couple of really important lectures in Kyiv, which helped my own thinking forward. And Vasyl has done wonderful work precisely in this realm of art and politics and about how one helps us to understand the other. So I'm very glad to be here with both of you. I think, number one, the reason why it's hard to understand the suddenness of this event has to do with the nature of politics in Russia. The less institutionalized a system is, the harder it is to predict. And the Russian system has been moving in the direction of pure personal tyranny for the last decade. And so I think we're now, at a point where social science and any kind of rational actor model are not very helpful. I think we're more in, Plato, chapter 8 and 9 of the Republic territory. We're more in Shakespeare territory, or psychological territory, because what we have to do is we have to understand the decisions of one person. So it's strange because we all would like to think that there's no there's no great man theory of history, but I'm afraid that in the case of this greatly evil man, we're not going to understand unless we understand him, which brings me to my second point. I think that Putin has changed over time. I think in the last 8 years since Maidan, he has become less tactical and more ideological. I think we see this in his speeches, which for their propaganda value are simply worse than the propaganda speeches he gave 8 years ago, and which seem, I could be wrong, but which seem to express a kind of heartfelt and sincere attachment to a rather crazy aesthetic portrayal of the world in which there's a missing unity, and it's his job as a great leader to restore some kind of unity to the world. So the only way to understand it, I think, is by understanding the way Putin has changed. And I think there's also a sense that aging leaders think they have to act quickly. They think they have to do something while they still have time. And that may be accentuated by the sense that Ukraine was being lost. Now, there was this strange situation where most Ukrainians and most Russians thought that Russia wasn't going to invade, whereas the Americans were trying to say that they were. And I just want to note here that it's interesting that the American intelligence got something right. I mean, right down to the day. Let that not be forgotten. And Vasyl can say more about how Ukrainians looked at this. But I think with the Russian propaganda, their furious and sarcastic and cynical denials about a war coming, I'm not sure they actually knew one was coming. I mean, I think it's not clear to me that the foreign ministry apparatus actually knew that a war was coming because it was made by a few people. So that's the best I can do on why now. And I'll be interested to hear what Vasyl has to say about it.
Yes, Vasyl.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you can, if you can speak to that, please.
Yeah, just I would like to make one point here, because what is really, because as Professor Snyder said, that it's really this kind of situation which somehow was on the one hand totally spoken about for months and months, but on the other hand nobody was expecting that to come. So that is exactly this kind of Don't Look Up movie situation, that you are constantly told that it is coming, but still you cannot believe it. And the reason why, so basically I would name two reasons from the Ukrainian perspective, as far as I can understand it, why it was so unpredictable per se. The first one was that nobody expected to have a full ground war, this kind of Second World War type of war that is now which is spread almost across the country. So we were trying to understand. So I also have to say that I won't name the person who sits in Kremlin by name, because I don't think it's a proper way to address him. So this Kremlin killer was basically, when we were trying to analyze his actions, so he was really very tactical. And when you look at the aftermath of Maidan, what happened with the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of part of the Donbas territories, it was more like this kind of tactics that he used the moment when the world was somehow distracted onto something different and the country was very weak. So he just grasped the moment and used it for his benefit. But this time it was totally different. Just all of a sudden, and employing all the variety of military, just really all the variety. Even I think this kind of blatant action wasn't even present in Syria, because here it was just right from the beginning, he started with all his power, with all his military, just trying to, perhaps he miscalculated the self-defense of Ukraine, of course. But at the same time, this readiness to employ hardcore, the worst military ever, this is really something unprecedented, really even more than the Balkan Wars in the 90s, I would say. And the second moment I would have to refer is this kind of a very strange ideological discourse that this war is being wrapped in. So from the outside point of view, but also here, even President Zelensky is constantly saying that this is really very hard, even to not just to understand, but just to even feel why openly, even to the Western journalists, to the whole world, to his president counterparts, he's just repeating constantly this kind of set of words, which is about denazification, about Nazis under Zelensky. He's constantly referring to some type of genocide. So as Professor Snyder mentioned, that we are of course in psychological territory. So maybe in some, I don't know, paranoid, or I don't know how to diagnose that, but in some paranoid manner, maybe this kind of ideology is just revealing what it is about so much that it doesn't have even any other vocabulary to express their anger, only the way to self-describe, I would say. So in this sense, it's really very strange. So I mean, perhaps I wouldn't say that anybody in the world can buy this discourse. It's just impossible, because it's just total bullshit, right? It doesn't make any sense, neither historically, nor socially, nor politically. So there is no dimension ever that this discourse can be referred to. So I'm also like speaking, being more on the liberal leftist side, let's say, right? So this is really strange. And so that's why the most striking thing for Ukrainians, that when we, at least what we perceive on the media level, that the outside world, the West, like listening to that, but at the same time, it's so we totally understand that it's the West opposes this and so on. But what is really striking, that you can impose absolutely bullshit vocabulary, which is just like a range of words without any kind of grounding, and that would be the reason for war. This is really something that I still cannot even think of about, because you don't have any rationality behind that. There is no reason behind that. There is only some drive. So that perhaps, again, this psychological territory, there is some very strange drive behind this, which is revealing through this type of discourse. And so in this sense, I think these parallels with the Second World War are not here drawn by occasion. But at the same time, militarily, I would say that is also very striking, that he perhaps also, what influenced very much was, of course, there are two key words as for me, like if you look at the events of the recent months. The first one is, of course, Afghanistan, and the second one is Kazakhstan. The second one, by the way, was not very much thought of by the West, because this what happened in Kazakhstan and the invasion of the so-called ODKB forces, how is it called? Organization, Collective Defense Treaty Organization, right? That was really super surprising. And everybody thought that like he's so successful, he can do this very fast. Though, of course, it's like the Kazakhstan was welcoming this, I mean, the authorities. But the main thing is like what is really clear, I have to say, that we can guess, because sorry for being a bit long, but we can guess, because during these last months we were like talking so many times about his psychology, what is really going on in his mind. So I've been always a bit like skeptical about this Putinology, like making some psychoanalysis for this person. Maybe he even doesn't deserve it. Maybe he needs some shouting therapy, like as we know Hitler had. But what is like really what we know for sure, that he hates Maidan. He hates everything connected to the revolutionary disruption. So that's even in Kazakhstan, he was mentioning that these are like Maidan technologies. So he is because the fundamental, as for me, methodologically, I would say even problem of the Russian authority is the lack of any kind of mechanism of the transition of power. They just don't have it, right? So that's why something like Maidan, or what they call metaphorically Maidan, any kind of unrest, disruption, uprising, revolution is the worst nightmare That is what he hates most, starting from the October Revolution to the Ukrainian Maidan in 2013-14. That's why the only basic reason I see of this kind of attack is just to kill Maidan, to erase it, to wipe it out ever.
But at the same time, you're seeing a complete demise of civil society in Russia as well. Like, what is this actually going to mean? It's not as if there's war in Ukraine, but there's actually, people are leaving en masse from Russia. And I mean, Professor Snyder, you can speak to this as well. I mean, it's not as if the repression is only going to happen, it will happen in violence in Ukraine, but there seems to be a disjointing of generations. Putin's language arsenal seems to be from Stalinist times. You know, it seems like to employ kill, deport, and then assimilate, you know, in some way. I think that was something also mentioned in your book, is like what is actually going to remain to culturally thrive under the conditions that he's putting forward in raising the country.
Is that to me? I mean, I'll say something really,
yes.
I'll say something really general, and then I'll let Vasyl think for a second. I mean, it strikes me that continuing a thought that Vasyl, I think, has begun, this way of thinking and talking doesn't lead to anything. There's no vision of the future in the way that Mr. Putin speaks. There's just a kind of annihilation. There's just a kind of nothingness. And I think that has to do with the problem which Vasyl mentioned, which I completely agree here, the problem of a lack of succession mechanism in Russia. So the entire future is taboo. The entire political future is taboo. And the fact that Mr. Putin will not be in power forever is also taboo. And so you have these overlapping, mutually reinforcing darknesses about the future, you know, and if I can speak about it in these kind of aesthetic terms, anything which creates some kind of light or anything which creates some kind of unpredictability is therefore despised and hated. And as Vasyl says, it has to be exterminated. And the actual Maidan, the way it actually happened, was an example of human agency and unpredictability and self-organizing civil society. And I think what Mr. Putin then tries to do is to transform anything which shows that we are unpredictable and colorful and we can meet new people, right? I mean, I remember Vasyl sharing with me 7 or 8 years ago the idea of the Maidan friend, like the person that you met in these unpredictable circumstances who you wouldn't have met otherwise, but who remains your friend, right? Solidarity in Poland was also like that. You know, civil society, which allows you to make connections in a way which, you know, no machine is actually going to predict. What Putin then tries to do is he tries to claim that all these things are mechanical. They're all part of somebody's machinations. They're all part of American machinations. He wants everything to be mechanical. There's this deep projection, I think, you know, I think one way to understand some of his language is that there's this very deep projection. He wants everything in Russia to be mechanical and predictable. And if something outside of his country is not mechanical and predictable, he wants to find a way to show how it is. And this I would add an observation here. Vasyl spoke of Maidan. I would just add democracy. You know, I would add democracy. Democracy is very unpredictable. I mean, there are a lot of things one can say about Volodymyr Zelensky, but the idea that Volodymyr Zelensky was going to be elected president, I mean, that's the kind of thing which only happens in an actual democracy. You know, in a fake democracy, you don't have these comedians coming out of nowhere with empty platforms and becoming president with 73%, right? It's only in the real world that, you know, a Jew shows up in Ukraine and gets 73% of the vote. That only happens in the real world, like the unpredictable world, like the beautiful world that humans inhabit and can be inspired by, right? That only happens in our kind of aesthetic world. It doesn't happen in a machine world. And so I think one of the things that Putin is doing is that he's trying to compress everything into categories where there's like a mechanical solution. And this brings me back to the very, you know, Vasyl's opening remarks about how all this is crazy and how it doesn't have a referent, you know, the quote unquote denazification, which, by the way, Vasyl, I mean, I've done a lot of talking to Americans about this, and although they don't see how it works, they are mostly puzzled by it as opposed to persuaded by it. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of folks from the Jewish community, you know, and people come to me and they say, I realize this is fucked up, you know, can you explain to me how? And then that's the phrase, which I'm only saying it that way, sorry kids, I'm only saying it that way because that's the phrase which is so often used to me. Like people come up to me and they say, I know this is this way, can you explain it? But I think the referent that it has is in the future. I think when he speaks of denazification and genocide and trials, what he's thinking of or was thinking of is some kind of tribunal where, a fake tribunal. So after having discredited the words, making them meaningless, he then discredits the institution of post-war justice by putting civic and political and cultural leaders of Ukraine on some kind of sham trial and charging them, quote unquote, as Nazis and so on. I think that's the referent. And that's all part of this process of like making everything a predictable machine, sapping the life out of everything, literally killing, figuratively, been literally killing whatever is active and unpredictable.
So do you see that as a reemployment of like the NKVD days of the 1930s? Like he's just planning to push everyone toward the Western Ukraine, everyone else will be in flight, and then there'll be mass trials after that?
With Putin in the past, what I think I've learned is that it's all a kind of mashup. He pulls this from here and this from there, and he doesn't actually know any period of Russian history well enough to copy it. So I hesitate to make any analogy which is too close to the actual Russian past or the actual Soviet past. But fundamentally, what the NKVD was good at was in crushing out alternatives, right? That's what it was good at. It didn't have its own vision, but it was good at crushing alternatives. And that's the tradition that Mr. Putin is in. You provoke, you draw in, and then you make other alternatives impossible, right? It's a kind of anti-revolution. It's not about creating a future. It's about making everybody else's future impossible. And so in some way, that's how the NKVD worked, but that's as far as I would push the comparison. I'd be interested to hear what Vasyl thinks about all this stuff.
Vasyl, also, I would like you to speak a bit about the Cultural Research Center, an initiative that you started, and how I can imagine that was quite an alternative forum even within the time prior to the war. If you can speak to that a bit and what has happened to it and how you imagine it to...
Right. Yeah. Thanks. But yeah, just to pick up where Professor Snyder just left, it's really, I think that this nuke terrorist is basically facing really some kind of a mission impossible task, right? Because his main aim is basically his basic question is how to rule eternally. How is it possible? How to organize that? So that's why what you asked about the Russian society, I think fits very much into that, because it's also like you mentioned that it's not only the war against Ukraine, but it's also the war against the Russian society. And during the last years, you saw these kind of processes or this kind of quasi-revolutionary or uprising processes were coming closer and closer to Russia. Take Belarus, take Kazakhstan, right? So it's like it seemed like that something also can maybe happen also in Russia itself. But this crack on any revolutionary intentions in the neighboring countries was also somehow defined by that fact. And in this regard, yeah, he is of course like a flagman of counter-revolution. That is his like main goal, in order not to make any kind of alternative or possible revolution happen in his neighborhood, or how he perceives that. But at the same time, with regards just to go back to this question about the Russian society, I think it's also very interesting, because now even during these last days of the warfare, it has so much has changed, of course, because now you can be punished almost for 15 years, if I'm not mistaken, for like spreading the truth about the warfare that is going on. But what was also interesting, and we, by the way, as the Visual Culture Research Center as well, have been fighting also for that cause as well. What was interesting that basically, you know, I'm not like on the side of like blaming the Russian society as such. I think this is not the case. At the same time, we see like when the war just started, and there were also like thousands on the streets, but at the same time, take into account this is a country of 140 million people, and there were not tens of thousands of people across Russia, not hundreds of thousands, as it would be in Ukraine, basically, right? If something like that happens, there were just a couple of thousands, and this is also very telling that somehow and another thing also, that we as a cultural institution that we're working in this kind of educational artistic realm, right, was also we referred to that. And also we were trying also to persuade our Western partners to boycott Russian institutions in that regard, because you basically don't have any Russian institution in the cultural field or elsewhere, not a single one, can you imagine, that took a stance politically and called war a war, named an aggressor. Some of them, as some cultural institutions in Moscow, they just suspended their activities and proclaimed that there is some abstract human tragedy unfolding in Ukraine, and that's it. So the wording, the vocabulary again is also very, very interesting here. That they basically, so institutionally, like those quasi-institutions that do exist in Russia, and also in the social realm, you see that somehow this is more or less maybe not the same discourse as the Kremlin is trying to impose, but at the same time, this is very cautiously formulated, just of course because of the situation there. But at the same time, let's not forget what happened in Russia last year. You have this absolutely powerful and super important political phenomenon of the politician Alexei Navalny, who is now in jail, right? So that was the same there. That and he is basically the only person as a phenomenon and as an individual who speaks up openly and calls a spade, as they say, right? So I mean that if you swallow Navalny's arrest and finally you agree with that, if you swallow the situation in the Russian jails when prisoners are being raped in a just unbelievable manner, if you so this is a process which takes you for years, of course, but it goes step by step. So if you agree on one thing, then you agree on another, and then you find yourself in the situation when you cannot speak up even just in absolutely simplest manner. So in this sense, I think that even so, in spite of all the difficulty, but keeping silence is being complicit, right? I mean, that this is, I'm just trying to say that let's not forget that this is also a responsibility of the Russian society. This is because even those, when I'm now reading different like oppositional Russian media, like many people who are fleeing Russia at the moment and who are oppositionally like thinking towards the authorities in the country, they all sort of like formulate it in the way that we cannot live in this Russia, so we will be back when in some beautiful Russia in the future, when people will think differently, when there will be a different authority and so on. But they don't understand that this process is not just a miracle, that you have to go through this. And it entails a lot of pain. It entails a lot of suffering, because Maidan was not just some, blockbuster festival in the city center. It's a hard work, because politics is always about super hard work, everyday work, which brings you a lot of discomfort, and you have to go through this if you really wish to achieve anything civic in the future, because this is absolutely a situation that this war like canceled the future. We have no imagination whatsoever to understand what is in front of us. But I'm just trying to stress this moment that so because like look at Belarus a year and a half ago, right? such a beautiful and powerful uprising all across the country. But at the same time, I mean, that Maidan also showed that, you know, at some point, the society has to be ready to exercise some force in order to change the status quo, even violence. If we speak about revolution, because without that, it's not a miracle that it's not, you know, because as the Russian propaganda was depicting the Ukraine, the map of Ukraine, like dividing different parts of Ukraine as a kind of set of presents, that this part of Ukraine was presented to Ukrainians by Lenin, this part by Tsar, this part by Stalin, like, you know, Santa Claus came and brought a lot of presents. You know, this kind of, so they also perceive like this doesn't come as a New Year present. It entails and it demands some really hard suffering and hard work in order to achieve that. And you have to go through this. And we also, so I totally understand how hard was that under Lukashenko. He is just, I mean, self-proclaimed paranoid, and that's totally clear. But at the same time, if you are not ready to apply some force, so it's another question when to apply it, because as we know, the main rule of the revolutionary violence, as well in general, proper political violence, emancipative violence, is a proper time and proper space, right, to apply it. So if you are not ready to do that, you will lose. So that is also the lesson of those unrests, and also you can inscribe this wave of the Orange Revolution, of the colorful revolution that the Orange Revolution was part of, right? But you can also refer to the Arab Spring and all these square occupation movements across the world, right? That this is the main lesson to be drawn from that. The society has to be ready to stand still and to apply some force in order to change the situation. When you are not ready to do that, you can be really easily lost.
Vasyl, you're here in a forum that has an international community, and I have to ask you, there is a very simple question, but an important question. In what way can the international community help in terms of course, you are within a field that is in culture and art. You know, I imagine.
I'm not sure about that yet. Yeah. This is a good question. Thank you, because also communicating with our Western partners and colleagues across Europe, and this is very typical, because you know that the problem is, as I've been always involved in this kind of educational cultural activities during my professional life, the problem is that this kind of so that is one of the things that I understood when the war started. You know, also personally, somehow I'm just sharing it out of my mind directly, that all the divisions that we had within the society, within the country, be it political, economic, cultural, or media, this is all being wiped out. So it doesn't exist anymore. So it's really very hard. So sometimes when I am approached currently by some European institutions to organize or to conceive some possible artistic or cultural project, sorry, but I will speak openly. It's just cosmos. They don't understand what is really going on. I don't think that I'm still keeping hopeful, but I'm doubting that we will be able to conceive any artistic projects in the near future at all, to be honest, right? So I mean that this is what the war brings. It just mixed everything, and it makes everything like a kind of bloody, nervous knot, some strange knot in which everything is sort of kind of as a result of the bombardment, you know, when you have all these parts all together, coming from different materials, parts of the body, maybe this is really parts of the body without the general body. So in this sense, I don't think that the Western community can help us culturally, of course. So in this sense, we are all on the front line, wherever we are. And unfortunately, like the main appeal at the moment, of course, is to get some profound military help also. And of course, we all know these discussions about no-fly zone over Ukraine. But because, it's also like judging from the local context here, it's like it also seems, I totally understand the US and the NATO arguments. I totally share this, but and they also understand that they understand our despair in that regard. But at the same time, when you are here, it seems like that the West is just observing some extermination without really intervening. I mean, this is kind of a feeling, and that we all have here. And so I understand why it is made like that. But the problem is that that it seems like that we are a kind of still perceived as a secondary country in a way. That I like imagine that some like one rocket on some, I don't know, Polish or Czech soil, that would be totally different situation. But almost 500 rockets on the Ukraine soil, right, is still. So I understand the geopolitical framework we are in, right, and but another problem I think exists here, that maybe the West in general, but the US maybe here are like a good exception in that regard, but especially the European Union. They are totally always already too late. This is, I just cannot understand. Like they haven't learned anything about since Maidan and from Maidan. Though, by the way, you asked about the center that I'm running and the Kyiv biennial that we are also organizing. It was one of the first intentions after the Maidan revolution to organize the Kyiv biennial in order to, after the revolution, that some sort of new country emerged, because it was really unprecedented. We managed to get rid of some bloody authoritarian leader, almost, well, not peacefully, but with some violence. But at the same time, we managed this. This was really unprecedented, like that, really history was playing out in front of your eyes, and with your participation, with our participation, personal as well as institutional. So, but it seemed like that the EU hasn't learned anything from that experience. Though our intention with the Kyiv biennial was exactly to show to the outside world our sort of local political practices that they can learn from, and also to invite them to Ukraine to be acquainted with the situation, to make sort of Maidan a kind of a translocal knowledge for the whole political spectrum in Europe, right? But I just cannot understand. So obviously there are these always like these business interests and so on, but all the types of decision-making processes, they always do it super late. Even when the US was constantly warning, they are again very late. Even with the weaponry, with the military help, with the financial aid, I don't really understand it. I think that somehow, that maybe again we are in some type of psychological or psychopolitical maybe territory. I think that this generation of the political leaders which are governing currently in the EU countries, right, that they just they don't have war in their experience. They just forgot what is really war is about, right? Maybe that's why it's the same with the Soviet leaders in comparison with the current Kremlin circle of people who are deciding on what is going to happen. That the Soviet leaders knew themselves what was the Second World War. Some of them even took part in that, right? So the current Kremlin leaders don't know whatsoever like what is war about. They just launched war in Chechnya, in Georgia and stuff, in order to keep their grasp on power. But I think that the current European leaders just don't understand literally what it really means to lose everything. that is exactly what war means. That's why that for them it was just somehow even beyond any kind of imaginable framework they have in their heads, like that that impossible is possible, right? So in this sense, this is the choice: revolution and war, right? Both are impossible sort of political, quote unquote, political events, and but both of them can become possible, right? And now it's unfortunately the war that
Yes, when
became
I reached
possible.
out, it was when I reached out to you, you said immediately there's no room for words, and it's when language fails, and there's a different agency for the artist, which you're saying becomes a much more militant situation.
Right.
We have nearly 300 people participating here, and I believe that we should give voice to some of the questions that are here, because I'm sure that there is quite an international and probably from Ukraine as well questions. There's somebody, Molly, how would you like to proceed with the questions here?
Why don't I ask a cluster right now that all relate to this question, Vasyl, that you've just been bringing up? And I have to say, I found it really striking and quite powerful when you make what seems to be now obvious point that there's no room for artistic projects in the current moment in war. And it does seem to me like it speaks also, Tim, to what you were saying earlier about Putin's intention of wiping clean any kind of freedom and democracy, of really pushing a mechanized vision of the future, in which, of course, art is no longer possible, right? So war does this quite significantly. So we do have two art-related questions. Let me just read portions of them to you. The first one is asking what role art or creative expression plays in the Soviet or Putinist mythology, Tim, that you were talking about a bit earlier, and how opponents might exploit that to maintain this connection between the Russian people and the West. This is one question. Perhaps I'll ask one more as you're thinking. Again, it's related. As Russians shut down their own media, and also as Ukrainian media sources are shutting down, what role will Ukrainian artists play in resisting and undermining Russian propaganda? Is there a network of artists already working on this? How can Western artists support this effort? This, again, Vasyl, you answered this in part, but perhaps we can continue along these lines, thinking a little bit about the kinds of artistic expression that either was happening before a week or two ago, or that might still be going on.
Let me take a crack at that, because I think so about art and Putin and Russia. I think it's important to understand that Putin's vision is a highly aesthetic vision. It's a vision of a world which has been fragmented and has to be brought back together, and only he understands how the world will be brought back together. That is, incidentally, a fascist vision of the world. It doesn't. The thing about the fragmented world is that the fragmented world, the one where pieces don't fit together, is the one where we get to be free. And the world of what Mr. Putin calls historical unity is the one where all the pieces have been put together in a puzzle, and only the great puzzle master knows what to do. And so, I mean, I can't prescribe particularly, but I think the project of art in that situation is a project of revealing variety and ennobling variety and affirming variety, you know, rather than lying down and worshiping some, you know, one person's vision of unity. And I would just stress, I'm not disagreeing with Vasyl about the present, but I would just stress that I do see how important the last 8 years of artistic and cultural creativity in Ukraine have been for the Ukrainian response now. So, I mean, now is not the time for, you know, for festivals, but it is a time, I think, for us in the West to look at the way that Ukrainians have been able to talk about this war, communicate it to us, the language that they have been using, the way that they've been able to reach different constituencies in the West, the ways that they're trying to talk to Russia or Russians, all of these things, although of course from Ukraine, it's horribly frustrating and isolating. But all of these things are evidence of the enormous renaissance that there has been in Ukrainian culture in the last 8 years. And as I think Vasyl and I agree, part of what's happening is that Putin wants to make sure that that art never plays that role again. That art never plays the role of, I'll use the Russian word of obnazhenia, that never plays the role of revealing what's actually going on, of pulling the scales from our eyes so that we can actually see. And I've just, if I could add a couple more thoughts, that Putin talks a lot about language. He talks about how the problem is that Russian speakers, blah, 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 Russian speakers are being oppressed. But what he really wants is not about what language is being spoken. He just doesn't want anything to be said in that language, right? So like, Vasyl speaks Russian and lots of people speak Russian and lots of Ukrainians speak Russian. But when you listen to them speak Russian in 2022, what they are incorporating is this cultural experience of Ukraine, especially of the last 8 years. The way they talk Russian is different, right? It's Ukrainian and it has to do with a different experience. So it's not about what language is being spoken. I think by now we all know that this is complete nonsense. The real problem is what is being said in that language, what's being formulated in that language. And I just want to add, since we're getting towards the end, I just want to say another word of thanks to Vasyl. An example of how Ukrainian aesthetic understandings of politics have radiated outwards is my book on tyranny, which is deeply rooted in Maidan. Chapter 13 is called Practice Corporeal Politics, which is a phrase that I stole from Vasyl personally, and that has to do with Maidan and the idea of putting that politics is about where you're willing to put your body. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you, Tim. I would like to add something, since I had actually worked within Ukraine from 1990 to 2000, and when there was no contemporary art center as of 1990, there was no canon of contemporary art that was legitimized by the art world at that time. And it took us 5 years to establish the Center for Contemporary Art. And it started with taking over a nuclear battleship called the Slavutich, which today was destroyed by Russian forces in Mykolaiv. And that was an attempt of artists who had not been validated by any system, by the Soviet system, including Boris Mikhailov, and Arsen Savadov, Senchenko, Chichkan, Hnilitsky. A lot of these people are dead. Hnilitsky has died, Reutbert has died. But it was an attempt to see how some other trope of an understanding, some other genre of interpretation of art could define a contemporary art movement in Ukraine. It was not validated, and it was not validated by the international art community. It took a very long time for the international art community to even regard what was going on in Ukraine at that time, because it was so relational. Until Nicolas Bourdieu actually categorized relational aesthetics, was it okay and cool and trendy to start looking at what was going on in Ukraine, when this was going on well before it being somehow commodified and even given a genre in the international art world. And I would ask the international art world to see what is going on here in a trope, a trope of art that is outside our understanding, our traditional understanding, and even our contemporary understanding of what is art. Because what Vasyl is bringing to the fore are very important categories of art that we need to take into consideration seriously, even though they might not be object related.
Perhaps a quick follow-up, Vasyl. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question. We also received another question in the Q&A about what the possible role of social media might play in formulating some kind of a resistance art practice. This would be something quite different than a kind of corporeal politics that Tim is mentioning. But I'm curious to hear what you might have to say about that. Does social media play a role as you see it?
Right. Well, perhaps this kind of, so it's basically very, as you are right, it's like in this corporal involvement, but at the same time, this is just another front of the fight in this war. So I do believe that without that, we couldn't convene our voices to the outside world. But also wanted to get back a bit about this issues which are circulating around art and propaganda. I also have to say that I don't think that it should be art that would sort of subvert the mechanism of the Russian propaganda, because this is just we are speaking here about yeah, it's like comparing blue and square. You know, these are phenomena of totally different nature. So we have been, as an institution, we have been also collaborating totally internationally oriented. We have been collaborated for years. I mean, since our inception in 2008, with so many Russian academics, artists, and so on. So that was never the question. Again, it was never the question of language or any kind of collaboration. But at the same time, I think, especially after Maidan, you know, there has been really, this is really very important to understand that to some extent, in order to understand the social and political processes which have been taking place in the art scene, in the cultural field in Ukraine, you have, they have been always very much defined by the revolutionary events. Because basically it was the Orange Revolution 2004 that out of which a new critical, politically involved and socially engaged art was born. So it's also very interesting that these milestone changes in the how artists think of themselves, how they co-organize, what they do, which media they use. All these was very much defined by by revolutionary events, and the same was in Maidan, because Maidan itself was like a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, right? What is called in German. This kind of total piece of art, sort of, is like a kind of Boysian installation, right? Which has been constantly medialized and was also a playground for different artistic initiatives, including ours, right? We were running the Open University of Maidan directly on the square together with the protesters there in Kyiv. And so it was an interesting, like a fundamental change that even before Maidan, you know, the so-called politically involved art was rather a minor trend. So it was very much present, of course. I mean, we have been always oriented in that direction, obviously. As an institution, and like the colleagues that we work with, and institutions and partners that we work with, but interestingly, only after Maidan, being political became somehow compulsory, became just unavoidable. You couldn't avoid political issues, because everything really, that is also like a beautifulness of democracy, perhaps, that everything becomes political, and I like this very much, because it gives you freedom and potential for moving forward, in the sense that so in the sense that Ukraine is really this is really interesting, that in this country art can have a political impact. Unlike in many cases in the West. This is really very strange, that perhaps it's somehow it's because that the different social fields that we had, or still we have, perhaps, or we will have, I hope, they were sort of not so much professionalized, right? They were not autonomous in the sense like that the cultural institutions are operating in the West. So there were no clear borders, no kind of clear buffer zones between different fields, I would say. So that's why politics and art have been always very much connected, and what you make in art can have a direct, really very direct, like even in several months, even direct impact on some political issues, on the political mainstream, even on the educational field. So this is very like a very vivid situation in which like artists and different other social agents and cultural practitioners, all of them were involved all together. So that was like what Professor Snyder called really some type of renaissance. In that regard, I can really partly agree, because it was this kind of vivid post-Maidan vivid situation, which was also, let's not forget that this situation was disrupted by the occupation and annexation of Crimea and occupation of the Donbass and the war itself, because this full-scale war is just the continuation of the war which started 8 years ago. That was the main disruption of those processes. We don't know, by the way, what would happen if not the war started in 2014, which society and which country we would have after Maidan. That is totally like super interesting political and artistic experiment in a way. So in this sense, I really admire this situation when art and all culture and like all these discussions, everything is politicized, very tense. You have like various sides, but at the same time, it brings you some really energy and some strength and feeling of like power that you can influence directly the agenda that your country is moving in. Like, so you can have, yeah, you are part of this agenda, right? You can define this agenda, no matter how autonomous or how small you are. We are totally, of course, so we are an institution, but we started as a grassroots initiatives at the university. Most of our people are coming from the cultural studies background. So the same was in the university. So there has been always this kind of very good ground for both artistic expression and politically motivated actions. So and we have been doing both in a way.
Yes,
so we were also, yeah.
Vasyl, I would also like to say that you know, we in the West still have time constructions of these categories, but I think we should continue this and find other ways to continue this discussion and not to end it right here. I also want to say something that in the occupation of Crimea, there has been very little discussed or recognition of the Crimean Tatar people. That it was not only an occupation of Ukraine, but it was an occupation of the Autonomous Republic of the Crimean Tatars. And when Mustafa Zhemilev became the chairman of those peoples in 1989, he made it his priority to first seek cultural autonomy for the Republic under Ukraine, not under Russia, and not to seek independence, to understand it was important for them to understand and define themselves culturally, because they had been dispersed within 2 days by Stalin, 25,000 people to the Central Asiatic republics. So it's important to understand that there is a possibility to think about art in another way, despite this calamity that's going on. And that by tradition, Ukrainians' literature from the late 19th century to the early 20th century has been a socialist literature, has been a literature based on socialism. And that's from Drahomanov and Lesya Ukrainka, Ivan Franko, and Khvelyovi. These people were really valuing the anti-imperialist, almost anarcho-syndicalist positions. And it's important to revisit that as well. With that, I'm sorry to cut this off. There are questions. Vasyl, we will share with you those questions. Professor Snyder, thank you. Molly, thank you. It's just made me understand that we have to continue this discussion. And Vasyl,
let's do it again. Vasyl has a lot to say.
Let's do it again. There's no reason this can't continue. Part 2, part 3, part 4.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Stay tuned for the next
Very
installment.
thankful.
Thanks, everyone.
Спасибо.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. See you, Vasyl.
See you, team. Thank you.
Yeah.